delighted to present Dr. Bill Hare. Bill is a very well-known face within the COP community, and I first met Bill, I think in COP3 in 1997 when you were with Greenpeace International, or Greenpeace Australia International, and I was with Friends of the Earth International. And Bill has been a friend and a mentor to policymakers, environmentalists, and a whole host of other people who have been trying to grapple with the increasing urgency of this agenda. Bill, of course, is the chief executive and founder of Climate Analytics, but he's also a scientist and a physicist with 30 years of experience in science, the impacts and the policy responses to climate change and stratospheric ozone depletion. He co-founded Climate Analytics to synthesize and advance scientific knowledge on climate change and provide state-of-the-art solutions to global and national climate change policy challenges. We're delighted to welcome him here. Bill, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malini. Maybe we get up the first slide. I'm going to give you a bit of a rundown of where we stand on science, climate action, and focus a bit at the end on the fossil fuel phase-out issue. So do we have the... Yeah. Maybe you could show the full screen. Yeah. So the next slide, please. So... a bit more dynamic, so we need to get through that. To the next one. So where we stand now on the global warming front is pretty much what the scientific community is telling us. We have had and experienced very unusual warming driven by human activities, the highest CO2 concentration in 2 million years, and this last year we've had probably the warmest year since the end of the last interglacial 125,000 years ago. So we definitely know all this is due to human activities. The next slide, please. So over the years, the IPCC has tried to assess for policymakers, politicians, government officials, and others, how impacts and risks translate against different levels of global mean warming. The figure here is the burning ember diagram between two assessments, the fifth and the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, but we first started this in 2001 in the third assessment report. And the main message to take away from this figure across the 5 reasons for concern that the IPCC originally identified is that the risks get higher at lower levels of warming every time we update the assessments. I know of no case where risks have reduced, actually, and this is the same picture you see here. The very bottom curve there, the blue on the left-hand side, is the 1.5 degree pathway, and you can see that already by the time you get to 1.5 degrees, you've got quite a few systems that are getting into moderate, or in 1 or 2 cases, very, very high risk. So that's the overall picture, and since the IPCC was published, I would say more evidence has emerged that reinforces this picture. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to draw your attention to, because it's a very big development for the IPCC, is the sea level rise assessment. Over the whole course of the IPCC until the 6th assessment report, the scientific community only showed you the picture until 2100, which is the left-hand part of this figure. But for the first time in the last assessment, the scientists put together their estimates of what the likely sea level rise is, or the possible sea level rise is by 2300. And I think this is something that should alarm everyone, because you're looking at the potential for multi-meter sea level rise within a couple of 100 years as a consequence of ice sheet disintegration and so on, which I'm sure you've heard about. So this is where we're headed unless we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees. We know from all the tipping point reports that have been published regularly over the last few years that we have to keep this warming level down to 1.5 degrees to reduce the risk of massive sea level rise. So that's something that's going to affect billions of people ultimately if this is not brought under control. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just draw attention to one main issue on the impact side, which is the risk to human health from extreme heat. This is the figure from the IPCC synthesis report showing how you see that the areas of high risk spread rapidly with each increment of warming. Now, I wanted to focus on the next slide, which is about lethal heat. Lethal heat is a combination of heat and humidity, which starts to cause livability issues for people, that is survivability issues. About a decade ago, a very important paper published in a proceeding of the National Academy of Science, which sort of mapped out the livability envelope for humans. But when you get a combination of high humidity and high temperature, then you get into the realm where people can no longer cool themselves, right? So already at 1.5 degrees of warming, you see there's an exposure to 6 hours a day for sometimes during the year to large numbers of people in what's called non-compensable heat and humidity. That is where your body can't compensate, which means it will be dangerous to be outside or in an exposed condition. By the time you get to 3 degrees warming, which is roughly where we're going with current policies, you can see the areas at risk literally explode, right? And you can look in particular at 1.5 degrees warming at South Asia, basically 1 billion people exposed to potentially non-compensable heat within a few decades, even at 1.5 degrees warming. And I guess one of the messages here is the challenges this is going to pose to adaptation measures. There are many challenges at 1.5 degrees to adaptation. I can't go through them all, but no one should assume that 1.5 degrees is safe. It was a compromise reached in Paris as the lowest feasible level of warming we could see with the most aggressive policies. Sorry. Okay. Sounds loud. Okay, next slide. So the next question, I guess, that arises, particularly now, is 1.5 degrees still in reach? The IPCC 6 assessment shows how it is, and it's got extensive analysis of that. The International Energy Agency's net zero roadmap also shows very clearly that the window to 1.5 degrees is still open. It sounds quite astonishing to think, well, is it actually feasible to nearly halve emissions by 2030? And the answer from our scientific community is yes, it is feasible and it's beneficial and it will be better off for most people. So what stands in the way of this is basically politicians need to make the right decisions. So next slide, please. So I want to step through, next slide, a roadmap to 1.5 degrees. I guess you've all heard the story that we need to be peaking emissions by 2025. That's the latest IPCC assessment. 43% down by 2030, 60% down by 2035. And we need to get cracking with action. Otherwise, we're simply not going to make it. Renewable energy is the driver of this. Decarbonising the power system then enables you to decarbonise industry, transport, and so on. So the renewable energy systems in the power sector need to lead the way. Next slide, please. So, and this is just to emphasise the rapidity with which we need to be scaling up renewable energy in the power sector, more or less heading towards 80% penetration by the early 2030s in order to be able to decarbonise the rest of our economy. This is just so fundamental. It goes under the mantra of electrify anything you can electrify, basically, and do it cleanly. Next slide, please. So here we are looking at the kind of clean power trajectories. This is coming from work done by the Climate Action Tracker. So we know that essentially coal needs to be out of the power sector by 2040. In fact, out of everything by 2040, but the power sector particularly. And also what's often not understood is how quickly gas has to go out of the system. Coming from Australia, that's not well understood there, frankly, but you can see how quickly gas has to exit the power sector in order to create that fully renewable system. So that's a very big message for policymakers as well everywhere. Next slide, please. Wind and solar is accelerating across the world. I don't expect you to absorb the figures in detail here, but essentially we are seeing a massive scaling up of renewables around the world, not everywhere, not in all places, but it is very big. And it's almost into a pathway where if it kept accelerating, we'd be into a 1.5 degree trajectory for the power sector. So this is why you've seen the emergence at this COP of calls for tripling renewables by 2030, doubling efficiency, because that gets the power sector and other parts of our economy into the right pathway. More acceleration is needed, but it looks perfectly possible with the right backing. And that's why there needs to be strong conclusions from this COP on this. Next slide, please. Now, on the other hand, we know that the major emitters are not on track either. This is a selection from our 1.5 degree National Pathway Explorer. I'll come to the Climate Action Tracker shortly. It shows the difference between the blue pathways, which is the 1.5 degree pathways for countries, and where current policies are. You see, this is the source of the very big emissions gap. We're simply not seeing enough action fast enough from most of the major emitters. Next slide, please. Now, where do we stand on climate action? Let's look at the next slide in the climate action tracker. We look at about 39 different countries covering, 85% of global emissions so far. We track, and we have tracked since 2009, what the NDCs stack up to, pledges, targets, nationally determined contributions stack up. And what we find is the updating process has got very thin since Glasgow. There was a call in Glasgow for countries to update their 2030 targets, their NDCs, and policies, and very little has actually happened. Next slide, please. So where we end up with is looking at what are the current policies countries have in place, what are their pledges, the second column. Essentially, we're looking at around 2.7 degrees of warming by 2100 with current policies. Others reach slightly different conclusions, like 3 degrees warming from the UNEP GAP report, but it's within the range of uncertainty of these assessments. If you look at the Climate Action Tracker update and you're interested, you'll find we do an unpacking of the differences between ours and the UNEP GAP report assessment. NDCs are about 2.5 degrees warming. The main message here is that we're not seeing a really big improvement. The most optimistic scenario we look at is assuming all countries meet their 2030 targets and all countries meet their professed net zero goals. But not all net zero goals are created equal, and a lot do not have any pathway to get there. But if miraculously this was achieved, then you'd be cracking below 2 degrees, the balance of probabilities. But that is a very, very optimistic pathway that we still see we're nowhere near in terms of action. Next slide, please, which I think is the emissions gap. So we focused ever since Copenhagen actually on showing the gap between where emissions need to be, which is the green 1.5 degree curve, and where current policies and pledges actually are. And it's quite a large gap. Essentially, you can see there's some 25 gigatons of emissions that we still don't see parties committing to get to. So this gap hasn't really changed very much. Next slide, please. And this figure kind of summarizes what's happened since Glasgow. This shows the temperature estimates that the Climate Action Tracker has made since Copenhagen. For the pledges, that's the grey line, and then the blue line starting just before Paris is the current policies. And you see there's been a general progression of improvement in both the pledges and the current policies. There was a bit of a glitch here with the US rejection of the protocol of the Paris Agreement under Trump, but overall the trend is downwards. We get to Glasgow and it's basically flatlined. So the last 2 years we've seen very little improvement in the projected temperature outcome and very little improvement in the closing of the gap, right? So I think that's cause for alarm actually, given the political pressure that's been on action. Very little has happened. Next slide, please. So what's happened at this COP is we've seen a whole lot of initiatives. We count 32. Maybe there's more, I don't know, but 32 different initiatives have been announced. So the Climate Action Tracker team worked on trying to quantify the benefits of these initiatives. And we basically found that a lot of the initiatives announced overlap with the NDCs of countries, or are very difficult to measure, or have little or no follow-up. So let's go to the next slide where we look at the summary of this. One of these is the oil and gas accelerator. It's worth emphasizing this looks pretty much like a greenwashing exercise. We've tried to unpack this and see exactly what is being called for, but it's very limited in scope and very limited likely follow-up or compliance. Remember, similar promises were made back in Glasgow and indeed in earlier decades, so little has happened. So I think in the policy community, one is entitled to be worried that the kind of actions which are being proposed here are very much superficial. But that needs to be closely watched. Next slide, please. So here we show the summary of the COP28 initiatives. In brief, we see about 25% of the gigatons coming out of these initiatives overlapping with NDCs. In other words, they're embedded in what countries are already promising to do. We see about 25% being achievable. These are potential reductions on top of current policies where we can see a pathway to believing that the countries who are signing onto it will believably implement that. The larger part, we don't see how that's going to be done. Other countries haven't signed on, or there's no clear pathway to basically seeing how that's going. Now, remember also that some of these initiatives overlap with what was agreed in Glasgow. And very, very little of what was agreed in Glasgow was actually done. So I think that's part of the contextual framing that the Climate Action Tracker would draw your attention to. We're entitled to be very sceptical now of promised voluntary initiatives unless they're backed up by government regulation. Next slide, please. So there's another way of looking at what's going on out there. That's an annual report produced by a consortium of groups. Climate Analytics is part of it, the World Resources Institute, supported by the Bezos Earth Fund and Climate Works Foundation, and it looks at technological developments across a whole bunch of indicators, so you could begin to see which technological sectors are on track or not. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, there's not many sectors on track. So if you unpack this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but looking across all of the main sectors, we need to have transitions happening in order to decarbonize power sector, heavy industry, transport, housing, commerce. Essentially, it's not a great picture, actually. So there's a lot to do. These, one critique you could make of this matrix is it doesn't weight each sector by how much it should contribute. That's something we'll work on for next year, but it does give you a good snapshot of just where all the trouble really is in implementation. Next slide, please. And this is another way of looking at the same issue, where we see only a few things going in the right direction and some important issues, for example, going in the wrong direction or backwards. So very, worrying picture all up, actually, coming out of this kind of analysis, which is quite different from the Climate Action Tracker one. Next slide, please. So one critical issue is that the coal and gas phase out is well off track. That's one of the assessments of the State of Climate Action report, and it reinforces other assessments. So essentially, we should already be seeing a significant pathway downwards for coal globally. We're not. The Global Carbon Budget reported last week, or this week actually, I think, losing track of time here, but CO2 emissions from fossil fuels now at record levels. That's not going well. Next slide, please. So I think we can flip on a bit. Let's go past this. Fossil fuels at 1.5 degrees. The big discussion here now at the global stocktake is what happens to fossil fuels, right? There's a lot of countries, stakeholders calling for a fossil fuel phase out to be agreed here. The context is that to get onto 1.5 degree pathway, fossil fuel production needs to fall by about 40% by 2030 and continue a downward pathway. So that's let's say the physical context of what the energy system needs to do to get onto 1.5 degree pathway. Next slide, please. We know this is reinforced by numerous scientific studies, IPCC, International Energy Agency, and so this is really a very strong scientific imperative now. There's no way of really escaping from the need to do this. Next slide, please. Now we know that also, despite the picture of production being projected to go up, we also know from various assessments, ours, International Energy Agency, EMBA, that actually fossil fuel demand could peak as early as this year. Now, how could that be, right? You've got record CO2 emissions going on. Well, actually, what's going on is that the growth rate in renewable energy I referred to earlier is so fast that it greatly exceeds the annual increase in demand for electricity. So at some point, as the renewable capacity gets to the right level, it starts to eat into the supply from fossil fuels and will displace fossil fuels. So that's one key thing going on, and that affects principally the power sector. The other key thing going on is the rise of electric vehicles. Most rapid growth rate is in China, and that will start and is starting to eat into oil demand. So those factors, the main things, will start to cause fossil fuels to be displaced faster than they're needed by renewables and electric vehicles. So that is potentially possible. even though you might see a reduction, it's not fast enough though. That's the point. It's good, but we would need to basically make sure that accelerates. Next slide, please. So the International Energy Agency sort of reinforced this whole issue of the challenge with fossil fuels. It's produced a new update of its 2021 net zero roadmap a few weeks ago, showing that there's no space for oil and gas developments of any kind, new ones. It's also shown, I think, very clearly that it's possible to get to 1.5 degrees. I think that's one of the big messages I take from the net zero roadmap. And it's also shown that carbon capture and storage, which I'll come to shortly, is essentially one of unmet expectations. That is, carbon capture and storage has been promised many times, usually during periods of climate crisis. Industry comes up and says, oh, we can do this with carbon capture and storage. Governments relax, wait, nothing happens. I fear we're very much in that situation now, and that will link into the global stocktake discussion about unabated fossil fuel phase out. Next slide, please. So where are we headed with fossil fuels? If you stack up what is on countries' books, what countries are planning to produce at a granular level and add it up, you get to the red line here. The fossil fuel production curve comes out of the 2023 unit production gap report, the fossil fuel production gap report. The gap comes from the difference between the red line and the bottom line, right? So, and it gets bigger over time. So despite all of the talk about climate action, we see governments all over the place, whether the United States, Canada, Australia, the Emirates, whatever, all expanding their fossil fuel production, or planning to, despite the fact that we know that the demand has to be eliminated in order to get onto a 1.5 degree pathway. So that's the other big challenge out there. There's a lot of fossil fuel interest here at this COP. We have peak CO2 emissions. We also have peak fossil fuel lobbyists. You'll have seen that in the press, more than we've ever seen before. Next slide, please. So, just to reinforce that, there's just a general lack of progress on fossil fuel phase out with power plant pipelines in different places in coal, also on gas. So we've really got a bit of a mess here that needs to be dealt with, which is why there's so much pressure on the fossil fuel phase out language at this COP. Next slide, please. So right now, the central issue, which could drop at any minute in the GST text, some thought by now, some say midday, let's see, is how a fossil fuel phase out is described, if it is to be described in the global stocktake text. As you know, the global stocktake is a very important thing in the Paris Agreement. This is the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. It's meant to be a course correction mechanism. It says, and we know that we're way off track, we need to take steps. And we need to have a good, clear process with teeth between now and 2025, when countries are meant to put forward their next NDCs for 2035. The fossil fuel phase-out language is a very important part of that. Embedded in that is this reference to unabated fossil fuels. So I'll just step through that. Next slide, please. So what's meant by unabated fossil fuels is that you could reduce fossil fuel emissions by using carbon capture and storage in the power sector or in other aspects of the energy system that emits CO2 from fossil fuels. The only problem with that is it most likely won't work. The history of carbon capture and storage is one of essential failure over a very long period of time. Failure, either projects haven't worked or have not worked anywhere near the efficacy or efficiency that was promised. The biggest one in the International Energy Agency database happens to be a carbon capture project in Western Australia. You look at that, it's about 10% of the present capture potential, but you need to know it's actually only working at a third of capacity. That is so typical of carbon capture and storage. We really doubt whether this will work at scale. The other dimension to this is it's very much pushed by the fossil oil and gas industry. And what they refer to is abating their emissions at the production phase of oil and gas. So you might say you get rid of 10% of the emissions by stopping flaring methane or by capturing carbon dioxide from oil and gas reservoirs, putting it underground, but you end up with 10 times the emissions that are emitted because you cover that up. Now, we did an analysis we published a week or so ago here, looking at the potential consequences of adopting unabated language. We compared a pathway with a lot of CCS with one without much, and we made generous assumptions about the efficiency of carbon capture and storage, but you end up with another 90 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, more than 2 years of present emissions, sizable fraction of the remaining carbon budget by going down this pathway. In other words, it's not a no-risk pathway. It's pregnant with lots of major problems for the climate system and CO2. Next slide, please. So looking ahead now, the task of the stocktake is to map out a process by which countries are meant to put forward 1.5 degree aligned NDCs for 2035. That alignment, that call for NDCs to be aligned with 1.5 degrees is very important, that it's in the text. It's very important that there is a pathway, a political pathway, where countries need to check in on how they're going, and an assessment exercise prior to COP25 to say, okay, how have they stacked up? So at COP25 we can say, now we need more action. I'm pretty certain we won't be saying, oh, well, great guys, you've overdone it. No, it'll be, we really need more. So that's one of the critical things that needs to be in the global stocktake. It's somewhere in paragraph 190 right now, but we'll see the new version. But just some here would argue that could be the most important conclusion out of the stocktake, right? I mentioned fossil fuel phase out. It needs to be clear, that shouldn't be unabated, it should be clear fossil fuel phase out, but the process going forward to the COP25 is so critical, because if we get to COP25 and the NDCs are not matching or coming close to 1.5 degrees, there will be very valid questions about whether the Paris Agreement can and will work, right? So here we had constant calls that we must keep 1.5 degrees in sight. The only way to do that is to get these emissions down. If we don't do that, all the talk in the world won't make a difference. Last slide, I think, almost last slide. So we essentially need to build a new ambition cycle. Just to recap, we're heading to 2.7 to 3 degrees warming with current policies. The only way to get out of this is to make big decisions to get emissions down. Critical is that we peak emissions in 2025, so that's another critical GST decision, is to parties resolve together to peak emissions by 2025. We know it's possible. Sounds pretty tough, record CO2 emissions globally, but when you stack up all the opportunities, renewables, electric vehicles, methane reductions, some action on forestry, actually we could peak emissions. It's possible. And many are saying it. Our own analysis shows that the International Energy Agency is showing it, others. So resolving to do that would at least create a very strong message for COP25, a measurable outcome. We get to COP25, have we peaked emissions? I think that would be a very important political message coming from the scientific community for COP25. So maybe I'll leave it there, Melanie, and you can open up for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So thank you so much, Bill. That's pretty much a tour de force in terms of taking us through the science where we are right now and what to look out for. So the focus of the audience here is, of course, what parliaments can do, your legislatures. So they've been the missing link in so much of this, because we've not had legislatures taking an active interest in the NDC formation process, and certainly with very few exceptions, the actual delivery and implementation process. So hopefully that's about to change. We have members of parliament here in the audience, and certainly I'd like to call on them for their questions and comments to begin with. So if I may pass the microphone to yourself, please, Honourable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hare. That was a very good presentation. At least it gives us a very close insight as to the condition of global warming. I'm representing the Congress of the Federal States of Micronesia.
Oh, great.
It's one of those islands that is most impacted and adversely affected by global warming. And this is really a matter of existential threat to us, because much of what we depend on is really drawn from the ocean. And with global warming, it's really going to dissipate and eradicate the tuna resource from which we generate our main local revenue. Because, as you may know, tuna don't really like a warm temperatured water. So that will effectively dissipate that very resource. But not just that, but the islands are also being affected by sea level rise. What we know is that the sea level rise rate in Western Central Pacific is 4 times greater than the global average, which is 3-inch per annum. And we're already experiencing and witnessing the very impact of that, because 90% of our population live around the coastal area and also low lying ground areas. So water is already being inundated with salt water. The soil cannot be, it's no longer suitable for farming. And I'm very happy to hear firsthand just what is going to happen if nothing is being done by the global community, especially for the main or major polluters. So I thank you for that presentation, because it really gives me a closer understanding of where things are and what needs to be done, because this is a global challenge, and it also requires a global solution. And for us, small island developing states, we really need to bind together and just force through our legal framework, and calling on also our partners, global partners, to work with us, because it's a matter of existential threat. Without any what you call urgent action by the global community, I think we will face a very dire situation, and one that I don't think we want to be. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill. My question is, what the government have to do with the current NDC, 2030 NDC? Have to update, or only to present a new NDC for 2035?
Good question. I've been working in the Pacific for 35 years or so, and I must say, every time I go back to Atoll Islands, the Marshalls, Kiribati, Tuvalu, it's very, very confronting, very depressing. I don't know your country so well, but I know the other Atoll Islands, and it's a mess. And you're right, it's a catastrophic problem unfolding, and as you may recall from that sea level rise figure, the only way that this can be contained, and I emphasize contained because you won't eliminate it, is getting this warming down. And without that, basically there's virtually no chance, frankly. Virtually no chance for all the reasons you mentioned. And it's just so important. But right now I'm working advising the small island states. I have done for a long time, and they're working really, really hard, as you know, to try and get the best, most ambitious possible outcome. So I heard very strong messages at the Small Island States Coordination this morning about that. Carly, good to see you. Been a long time. The truth is, we really need countries to update both their 2030 NDCs and in 2025 come forward with ambitious 1.5 degree aligned 2035 NDCs. So those things need to go in parallel. And what could be more important is that countries actually do something, not just change a number, but actually crack on and get policies in place. Now, it's not as simple as that. Rich countries can get on and do it. And as we heard from Colombia yesterday in the Majlis, there needs to be a new approach to the economics of this. I mean, we work a lot with vulnerable countries, not just the small islands and LDCs, and the common message you hear there is, well, actually we want to do this, but if we take this loan to develop a renewable system, build a grid, the IMF says, hey, hang on, you've crossed over your debt to GDP ratios. No, you can't do it. So, and that was essentially, if I'm oversimplifying what Colombia was saying, that's exactly the problem, right? There needs to be some change to the international financial system, not just loans, but some change to the way in which all this is managed that provides countries, and I know Argentina's situation is not great right now, with the ability to progress with the decarbonisation trajectory, with the investments, and sidestep some of those international fiscal constraints that are imposed on so many developing countries, whether it's debt alleviation or new instruments or just new policy approaches. That's up for the specialists. But without that, I doubt whether we will see enough rollout of renewables fast enough. You have a discussion with African countries, you can see what a big problem this is unless it's solved. So I think, you know, one needs to think about that. And that means that in the context of NDC updating, that the richer countries need to deliver resources. I mean, we work with about 26 different countries on their NDCs, I think at last count, since 2015. And we've just done a bit of a check-in, like, what do you need for the next steps, etc. And it's about money. Of course, it's not only about money, it's about internal government coordination within country, but at the end of the day, it's all about where is the money going to come from? How do we get these loans? How do we get this in place? If you can't do that, very, very difficult to see how a lot of middle income and poor countries are going to progress this enough.
Okay, thank you so much for the spotlight about NDCs. But my question may take a different approach in the area of the carbon storage. You said carbon storage, like the carbon storage facility, organizations always mention when there's a lot of climate stress, emphasis given to climate stress. But I just want to ask, does that also denote it be more like a greenwashing technique to shift attention? Or like, because for me, I feel there has been a lot of emphasis from, for instance, the EU when it comes to carbon storage, but still they still discover more of oil wells and all. So does that give room for like shifting of attention to, you know, give room to more oil wells being discovered and all? Thank you.
Yeah, look, you're exactly right. Looking at the oil and gas sector, what we see is that the talk about carbon capture and storage is very much about some of their production emissions, right? So providing a veneer that they're actually reducing emissions, which they might be in the production side, but the majority of emissions, 90% or more, occur when you actually use the stuff, the oil in the cars, the gas in power stations or fertilizer plant or whatever, and that is not covered. So in that way, that's why we and others sort of describe this as essentially greenwashing. If the EU is focusing on CCS in Africa, I'm concerned to hear that, because I can't really see the economic case for rolling out a whole new technological system in Africa. It will distract capital from other needed developments. It will subtract from the welfare of the populations, because capital is scarce in Africa. We know that. It just doesn't make any sense at all to me. Yet we know that the renewable side of things can deliver development quite quickly. I don't mean just lights, I mean industrial scale power for industrialization in Africa. And we know that there's big problems to overcome to get the scale of capital investment into Africa. We know that. We know some countries have solved it and most haven't. So the focus on CCS seems really dumb to me, when we need to be solving the other bigger problems that will enable countries like Senegal or Mali or Cote d'Ivoire or whatever, Uganda, to make these huge investments needed to transform their energy economy and also transform the lives of people in their rural communities who presently don't have reliable power into a positive development pathway.
Can I just pick up on the point of the policy when it meets politics? So next year we have a large number of very powerful emitting nations going to the polls. We saw in the context of Nigeria, which is the largest economy in Africa, the difference that having floods which were inescapable and caused such havoc for populations, the way in which that affected the political dialogue, and climate change for once actually entered into the political contest. if you can offer your thoughts on where you see, politics has been extremely volatile, where you see some glimpses of hope. You'll know that yesterday we had hosted centre-right politicians here in the pavilion. It was absolutely packed out. And we heard language that we haven't seen coming out of Australia. I can't remember the last time when Conservatives were talking about making a dramatic shift into solar and wind so that Australia actually becomes a renewables power. Now that's pretty strong stuff. We've also heard pretty strong stuff from the host, Sultan Al-Jabbar, where he's talked about a radical transformation of the economy being needed across the value chain. So what is your expectation looking at what the declarations that have been made now, the electoral cycle we're moving into next year, about how politics can align with 1.5 or at least as close to?
Well, at the end of the day, politics is about people, right? I guess, at least where you have elections. And I think that people need to be communicating to politicians about their fears and concerns. So what you're seeing in Nigeria is people are beginning to panic about the effects. What you're hearing from the Conservative politicians from Australia is very much that their electorates are burning, literally burning, and they are having to move as a consequence. But the other story here is the opportunity story. I remember over the years sitting on panels with Republican governors who are presiding over massive growth of renewables in Texas or somewhere, and you ask, well, what's going on? It's the money, it's the opportunity, right? So politicians also like opportunity. And the opportunity can flow into development opportunities for people, jobs, reliable energy, and so on, water supply through reliable energy. So these opportunities need to be really taken to people to say this is an opportunity. It's not just a threat to the way that we've done things in the past. It can move past it. And I think that's part of what's going on in Australia. Now, this politics isn't perfect because you also see situations where, people are really fearful, panicking about climate change, but the political class is not reacting, right? So it's not like a perfect connection. And so that gap between the fear that people have and what the political system is doing is also a very important dynamic. So in Australia, for example, you do see Conservative politicians and others talking about climate action, but underneath that, actually, they're expanding fossil fuel production quite a lot, right? And they might be coming up with a storyline, well, if we don't export gas to Japan, their lights will go off, to put it colloquially. So these sort of stories you hear all over the world, right? And I think the challenge is for politicians to really get on the right side of history and to help bring their constituents with them. It's not just constituents should yell at politicians. Politicians also need to lead. And this is the biggest challenge humanity is going to ever face. And therefore, it's really important for politicians of all kinds to get, all complexions, to get on this pathway and to take advantage of the opportunities and to put the past behind.
So I think that's, okay, I was going to say that's a great point to end on, but if you can indulge us, maybe a couple of more points. Yeah, I need to give you the mic because we're live streaming.
Hi, yeah. I just was wondering, just on top of that, I think that there's a lot of polling, for example, that shows in many economies that climate action is broadly popular in places like the UK, Australia, in the US as well. And yet you do still see politicians actively working against that. And I was wondering if you could speak to why you think that is.
Yeah, it's so Richard Bezza from University of Leeds. It follows on from that. In the UK at the moment, as you all know, there's a lot of weaponization against climate change and climate action. And the question of the cost of living crisis for a leading climate country, which is also backsliding at the moment, how does one, in a sense, put across a message towards people in such a way that they are not, in a sense, they don't become hopeless around these kinds of 1.5 threshold numbers, which could be quite quickly crossed, even though it takes 10 years for actually it to be meaningful scientifically, and for them actually to be able to react in terms of their own local actions and individual actions in a way in which they can adapt to climate and at the same time be proactive. So what is the messaging for actually people on the ground who are probably quite fearful of these numbers and easily swayed by rather easy narratives around cost of living and so forth?
Okay, I guess I'd turn that around a bit because start at the other end. Climate policy isn't easy, and there's good ways and bad ways to do it. So, and I think that governments need to introduce climate policies that don't leave people behind, that make it easier for particularly the poorer parts of the population to cope. And that means designing policies that actually deliver, not talking about action. So, and you know, there's literally a lot of good examples and bad examples where government have messed up on policies because they didn't communicate them, or they even just weren't designed very well. But there are also really good examples where people are better off and know they're better off. So it's a challenge for government as a whole, including the political leadership of governments, to design those policies so they do deliver for people. They don't just talk about doing something and that it's great we do something, but actually show, actually we can address the cost of living with this, and you'll be better off. I'm a bit of a skeptic about telling people what they need to do in their lives. We've had a lot of that. I remember BP started this, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I've forgotten. But look, that's been a distraction. So what I say now is people need to focus on getting their political representatives, whoever they are, to actually rise to the occasion and step forward and push the right policies, right? And people can and will take action in their own lives, but the whole system needs to change, and the energy system, I mean. Otherwise, it just won't work. So, you know, I think that's important. Holly, on your question about the rise of a certain kind of politics, which is, you know, anti-evidence, anti-truth, and extremely polarizing, I think this is a bigger issue than climate change, actually. And there's been a lot of research by the academic community also into the origins of that. And actually, one of the things that I stuck in my head from the last 12 months or so, reading academic literature on this, is that a lot of the interest behind this are actually fossil fuel interests, right? So it's not an accident. And you could say maybe it's not just the fossil fuels, it's that some of the fossil fuel interests are actually quite right-wing as well. But I think we need to look at the way in which that's working. And that means we need to look and understand that the way in which the media can do a better job of unpacking that, rather than the he said, she said, tabloid approach. It's only through quality media that we can really see how people can untangle the network of half-truths or even lies from reality. And I think most of our democracies are facing a challenge in that way now. It's not a problem for a single country or a single language. You know, English. It's a problem. Look across Europe now, and so it's a major challenge for democratic institutions in general. Actually, it's not just a climate policy issue.
So, if I can just bring your thoughts to help us in concluding this, because of course the constituency that we're representing are politicians, and we're in a part of the world where we don't have democratic elected institutions by and large. And so isn't that one of the key dilemmas, that while Western organizations seem to be so fixated on Western democracies, that it's actually decisions which have been taken in this part of the world, which are going to be quite fundamental. And we've put so much emphasis on the strong leadership that the COP president has shown so far, because he wants to show that the UAE is a shining light, because Dubai is not an oil-producing emirate. So what is your message to this part of the world where there needs to be a recognition that success will look very different tomorrow from what it looks like now? Because Dubai is seen as a shining city. It's attracted huge numbers of immigrants from all over the world. 90% of the population here are foreign workers. So I think one of the things that's really been missing in so much of this discussion, I think, you know, over the last decades, is a recognition that all of these countries in the region, developing countries, have agency.
They choose to make decisions. They choose not to have a politics which is guided by climate change in Nigeria, in South Africa, in India. So how are the politics of those who are analyzing the policies going to be informed by this reality which this region represents? So really, because we're moving into the third petrostate that's going to be hosting a COP in succession. So we need to get a bit more lively and a bit more politically alert as to what the implications are. So if you can just help us unpack that, Bill. You don't need that.
I don't need no. I guess two would be helpful. It's a very complex question. I think that even in relatively autocratic states, public opinion matters, so that there's that level of engagement. But I think that we're really stuck with a system that may or may not change in the oil petrostate arena. And I think we need to sort of think about the theory of change by which you actually unhook ourselves from oil and gas. And I think wise rulers, if I can put it that way, of petrostates might come to understand that they might want to be the one that sells the last barrel of oil, but there's no guarantee. So they need to get ahead of the curve and invest in the alternative. So to maintain the level of wealth a country like the Emirates has built up will require sustained investment in the alternatives, as well as political investment in building the bridges to markets for that, right? And I would say there's a real risk, and it applies to democracies as well, that the more they focus on the old stuff, the less chance they'll actually have of getting a foothold in the new market. So that's something that analytically the governance system of these countries needs to think about. I don't know whether they're more likely to make a good decision or a bad decision than a democracy, right? So I think this is also a bit unclear to me. If you look at Saudi Arabia, they're definitely nowhere near, if we hear their interventions, nowhere near this. The Emirates might be. They've talked about it a lot. They've got some investments going on in the renewables area, but it's outweighed by factor 10 or more of investments in expanding oil and gas production. So that's the ultimate test. So I can't answer the question about how you swing that politically. I think the swing will come from the market, right? So I talked about how to peak emissions, right? And for an oil producer, electric vehicles are a deadly and mortal threat, right? So the more electric vehicles penetrate the market, the less demand for oil there will be, and the more oil producers will start to be in trouble. They won't get the scale, they won't get the market, prices will drop, and you could get a feed-forward effect. And the same thing would happen with the gas industry. You think about coal, right? You think, well, what happened to coal? And you remember the old days, you know, the coal industry crawled all over the climate negotiations. Yes, the lights would go off, we'd have poverty outbreak everywhere. Now what's happening? Coal is going down. I haven't seen a coal lobbyist around here, frankly. So coal didn't end because the coal producers decided it would end. It's ending because the market has shifted. Renewables are better, cleaner and faster, and governments are gradually beginning to see the light there. Not all, and I think the same thing is beginning to happen in oil. This is why Saudi Arabia has been reported as investing in locking in internal combustion engines in Africa, right? And they have this storyline that electric vehicles won't work in Africa, I guess because electrons don't work the same there, I don't know. But that's a fear of actually what's happening to the market. Looking at the gas producers, they've massively overinvested in liquefied natural gas export, huge amount of overinvestment, prices are going down. There's going to be a reckoning there. Either they will win and displace renewables in growing markets, or the markets will say, no, actually we're going to go faster into renewables, and you'll see them stranded. In other words, you will see demand destruction occurring, forcing democratic governments or rulers to decide to actually try and fight for the last barrel, the last megaton of LNG, or say, right, we've got enough cash flow now, we need to invest in the alternative before it's too late.
So wise rulers. And you'll remember 50 years ago, for those of us who can remember the first oil shock in 1973, there was a petroleum minister from this region, actually from Saudi, called Sheikh Yamani. And he very